My camping trip in Pennsylvania was a deadly mistake. Chapter 1: The Old Trail. The Allegheny National Forest is a place of contradictions. During the day, it's a 500,000-acre paradise of hardwood forests, winding rivers, and scenic vistas. But as anyone who's spent a night there knows, when darkness falls, the forest transforms into something else entirely. I'd been planning this trip for months, a solo backpacking journey along the North Country Trail's Pennsylvania section. After a year of working remotely, staring at my apartment walls, I needed to disconnect and breathe. The forest called to me with promises of solitude and renewal. What I didn't know was that others had heard its call too. Different voices, with different intentions. I arrived at the trailhead on a crisp October afternoon. The fall colors were at their peak, brilliant reds, oranges, and yellows painting the landscape in fiery hues. The parking area was nearly empty, save for a forest ranger's truck and a beat-up Subaru with Pennsylvania plates. As I shouldered my pack and checked my map one last time, the ranger approached. She was middle-aged, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of too many search and rescue operations. "Heading out alone?" she asked, her gaze scrutinizing my gear. "Just for 3 days," I replied. "I've done this section before." She nodded, but her expression remained concerned. "Trail conditions have changed since the storms last month. Some markers are missing and there's been activity. Bear sightings, more than usual. And some campers reported strange noises near Minister Creek." She paused. "If you've got a satellite phone, keep it handy." I assured her I would stick to established campsites and follow all safety protocols. With a final warning to be careful, she let me go, watching as I disappeared into the tree line. The first few miles were exactly what I needed. A moderate climb through tunnels of golden leaves, the only sounds my boots on the trail and the occasional chatter of squirrels. The stress of the city began to melt away, replaced by the rhythm of my breathing and the forest's gentle embrace. By late afternoon, I'd covered about 8 miles and was approaching my first planned campsite near a small stream. That's when I noticed the first strange thing: a series of symbols carved into tree trunks at regular intervals. They weren't trail markers. I'd been following the official white blazes all day. These were different, intricate shapes that resembled ancient runes or some kind of primitive writing. Curiosity got the better of me, and I paused to examine one. The carving was fresh, the exposed wood still light against the dark bark. Someone had been here recently, marking a path that diverged from the main trail. I should have continued to my planned destination. Instead, I made the first of many mistakes. I followed the marked trees. The side path was barely visible, more animal track than human trail. It wound deeper into a section of old-growth forest, where the trees grew so close together that they blocked out much of the fading daylight. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, and the forest sounds, so vibrant earlier, grew muted. After about a half-mile, the path opened into a small clearing dominated by the charred remains of what once must have been an enormous oak tree. Around its blackened trunk, stones had been arranged in a perfect circle. My skin prickled with unease. This wasn't a standard campsite or any official trail feature I recognized. It had the distinct feel of something ceremonial. Near the circle, I spotted a weathered leather journal, its pages fluttering in the light breeze. When I picked it up, a folded map fell out, hand-drawn, showing sections of the Allegheny Forest I knew, but with additions. Tunnels, chambers, and passages that couldn't possibly exist, seemingly extending beneath the forest floor. The journal belonged to someone named Ellis Hargrove, dated entries beginning 6 months ago. The early pages described conventional research, observations about forest ecology, wildlife patterns. the effects of climate change on the local ecosystem. But as I flipped forward, the entries grew increasingly erratic. Found another entrance near Teonesta Creek. One entry read, "The authorities have no idea what's beneath their feet. The settlement wasn't destroyed. It was abandoned deliberately. They knew what was coming." Another page contained a series of the same symbols I'd seen carved into the trees, alongside translations. Barrier, gateway, vessel, summoning. I was so absorbed in the journal that I didn't notice the daylight fading, until I could barely see the words on the page. Looking up with a start, I realized I was alone in an unfamiliar clearing, at least a half-mile off the main trail, with darkness rapidly descending. Camping here felt wrong on every level. I needed to get back to the marked trail, find a proper site. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Movement at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the gathering shadows. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding small in the vast silence of the forest. No answer, but the movement came again, a shifting of darkness, like someone or something retreating deeper into the trees. Gripping my hiking poles tighter, I hurried back toward the path I'd followed, the journal and map stuffed hastily into my pack. The forest had transformed in the twilight, the familiar trails and landmarks vanishing into shadows. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, sent my heart racing. When I finally reached the main trail, relief washed over me. I still had maybe a mile to my planned campsite, and only the dim light of dusk to guide me, but at least I was back on the established path. That night, I made camp beside a small stream, the sound of running water normally a soothing lullaby. But sleep evaded me as I pored over Ellis Hargrove's journal by the light of my headlamp. The entries grew increasingly disturbing as they progressed. Ellis described finding artifacts of non-human origin in the forest, speaking of watchers in the trees and voices from the earth. In the final entries, his handwriting had deteriorated to a frantic scrawl. "They know I've found them. The rangers aren't just rangers. Check their eyes, check their eyes. The settlement beneath is awakening. I've triggered something. God help me, I've triggered something ancient." The last page was blank, except for a series of coordinates and the words, "If found, burn this. Do not go there." I checked the coordinates against my map. They marked a location deep in the forest, about a day's hike from my current position. Off-trail, in a section marked as particularly rugged. Logic told me to continue my planned route, to ignore the ramblings of what was clearly a troubled mind. But as I finally drifted toward sleep, my dreams were filled with symbols carved into ancient trees and shadowy figures watching from just beyond the firelight. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night, the fire reduced to embers, my body rigid with the certainty that I wasn't alone. Through the thin fabric of my tent, I could see a silhouette, human-shaped but somehow wrong, too tall, too still, standing motionless at the edge of my campsite. My breath caught in my throat. I reached slowly for my flashlight, but before I could grab it, the figure moved. Not toward me, but sideways, with a jerking motion that no human could make, disappearing into the darkness beyond my camp. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat up, knife in hand, watching the tree line until the first light of dawn filtered through the forest canopy. Only then did I venture outside my tent. In the soft morning light, I discovered fresh footprints in the mud near the stream, too large to be human, with impressions that suggested claws rather than toes. And carved into the trunk of a nearby birch tree, still oozing sap from the fresh wound, the same symbols from Hargrove's journal. Someone or something had found me, and they knew I had the journal. As I broke camp with trembling hands, I faced a choice: continue my planned route, pretending I'd never found the journal, or investigate the coordinates Hargrove had left behind. The smart choice was obvious, the safe choice. But as I shouldered my pack and looked deep into the ancient forest, I knew which path I would take. The mystery had already sunk its hooks into me, pulling me toward whatever secret lay hidden in the heart of the Allegheny. I pulled out my compass, checked the coordinates one more time, and turned away from the marked trail. Some questions demand answers, even when every instinct screams to run in the opposite direction. It would be the second mistake of many, each one leading me deeper into an ancient darkness that had been waiting, patient and hungry, beneath the forest floor. Chapter 2. The Ruins. The coordinates from Hargrove's journal led me away from established trails and deeper into the Allegheny wilderness. My phone had long since lost service, and even my GPS device struggled to maintain a satellite connection beneath the dense canopy. I was navigating primarily by compass now, feeling increasingly isolated with each step. By midday, the terrain had grown challenging: steeper slopes, rockier ground, and vegetation so thick I sometimes had to backtrack to find a passable route. The forest itself seemed to resist my presence, branches snagging my pack and roots rising from the earth to trip my feet. When I paused for a water break, I noticed something unusual about the surrounding trees. Their bark was discolored in spiral patterns, as if some infection were spreading through them. And there was that smell again, metallic, like oxidized copper, growing stronger as I continued in the direction of Hargrove's coordinates. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon when I crested a small ridge and found myself looking down into a narrow valley. What I saw made me freeze in my tracks. Below, nestled in a clearing that shouldn't have existed in this dense forest, were stone ruins, walls of an ancient structure protruding from the earth like broken teeth. The foundations formed a perfect circle, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, with a smaller inner circle of standing stones. It looked like a primitive temple or observatory, yet nothing like this should exist in Pennsylvania. No historical record mentioned ancient stone structures in Allegheny National Forest. I approached cautiously, every instinct warning me to turn back. The ruins emanated a palpable sense of wrongness. Birds fell silent as I descended into the valley, and the air grew noticeably colder. The stone walls stood about waist high, covered in lichen and moss that couldn't hide the precision of their construction. Each block fit perfectly against its neighbors, without mortar or visible tool marks. More of those strange symbols were carved into the stones, the same ones from the trees in Hargrove's journal. In the center of the inner circle lay what appeared to be an altar stone, larger than the others and carved with a shallow depression. Dark stains marred its surface, too red to be mere rust or lichen. I touched one cautiously. It flaked away like dried blood, yet seemed impossibly fresh beneath the surface. "What the hell were you doing out here, Hargrove?" I muttered, scanning the area for any sign of the journal's author. That's when I noticed the entrance, a gap in the eastern wall that led to a stone staircase descending into darkness. The steps were worn smooth by countless passages, yet looked impossibly ancient. Cool air wafted up from below, carrying that same metallic scent, now mixed with something else, the unmistakable mustiness of enclosed spaces long undisturbed. Common sense told me to mark the location on my map and get back to civilization, to report this find to the Forest Service or perhaps a university archaeology department. But Hargrove's frantic warnings kept echoing in my mind. The settlement beneath is awakening. I've triggered something. I checked my watch. Only a few hours of daylight remained. Exploring unknown underground passages alone was foolhardy at best, suicidal at worst. Yet something compelled me forward, a curiosity that overrode my survival instincts. I switched on my headlamp, tested it twice, then began the descent. The staircase spiraled downward, far deeper than I expected. I counted 63 steps before reaching a landing that opened into a narrow tunnel. The walls were no longer natural stone, but seemed almost polished, with the same symbols etched at regular intervals. My headlamp beam couldn't penetrate more than 20 feet ahead, the darkness seeming to swallow the light. The air grew colder as I advanced, my breath visible in small clouds. The passage eventually widened into a chamber with a ceiling high enough that my light couldn't reach it. Stone columns, intricately carved with intertwining patterns, supported the unseen roof. More disturbing than the architecture was the evidence of recent activity. Fresh bootprints marked the dusty floor. A modern backpack leaned against one column, its contents spilled across the ground: energy bars, water bottles, camera equipment. A tripod stood nearby, aimed at the far wall. "Hargrove," I whispered, recognizing the backpack from its description in the journal. But where was its owner? The far wall bore a massive carving, a mural depicting human figures bowing before taller, elongated beings with limbs too numerous and joints too flexible to be human. The carved scene showed the tall beings emerging from a circular portal, bringing objects that the humans received with outstretched hands. Below the carving stood a stone pedestal holding what appeared to be a metal disc about the size of a dinner plate. Unlike the ancient stonework, this object gleamed as if newly forged, its surface covered with the same symbols found throughout the ruins. As I approached the disc, my headlamp began to flicker. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on my beard and eyelashes. Something moved in the darkness beyond the pedestal, a shifting shadow that seemed to flow rather than walk. "Hello," my voice echoed throughout the chamber. "Hargrove, is that you?" No response, but the shadow moved again, retreating into a passage I hadn't noticed before. I followed, drawn forward by curiosity and the growing certainty that I wasn't alone. The new passage sloped gently downward for about 50 yards before opening into another chamber, smaller than the first but more elaborate. Here, the walls were covered in metal plates with the same unreadable script. At the center stood a circular dais raised about 2 feet from the floor, its surface covered with intricate inlays that formed a pattern reminiscent of a compass rose or star chart. And there, sprawled across the dais, lay a body. I rushed forward, medic training kicking in. The man was middle-aged, bearded, wearing the gear of an experienced hiker. Ellis Hargrove, I presumed. He was unconscious but breathing, his skin cold to the touch. When I lifted his eyelids to check pupillary response, I recoiled in shock. His eyes were completely black, with no visible iris or sclera. And they weren't still, something seemed to move within them like oil swirling on water. "Hargrove," I shook him gently. "Can you hear me? What happened to you?" His body suddenly stiffened, back arching unnaturally. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and a viscous black fluid leaked from the corners of his eyes. Then to my horror he spoke, but not in English or any language I recognized. The sounds were guttural, clicking, impossible for human vocal cords to produce. I scrambled backward, heart hammering against my ribs. Hargrove's body contorted further, joints bending in ways that should have shattered bone. Then, as suddenly as it began, the seizure ended. He collapsed onto the dais, breathing heavily. When he opened his eyes again, they had returned to normal brown, bloodshot and terrified. "Run," he rasped, his voice hoarse but human again. "For God's sake, run. They're coming back." "Who's coming back?" I asked, keeping my distance. "What is this place?" "Not who, what." He struggled to sit up, every movement clearly painful. "They've been here longer than us, sleeping beneath the forest. I woke them when I found the disc." His eyes darted to the shadows around us. "And they're hungry, so hungry after all this time." A low vibration began to pulse through the chamber, making the metal plates on the walls hum in eerie harmony. Dust and small stones skittered across the floor. "It's too late," Hargrove whispered, his expression collapsing into resignation. "They've found us." The dais beneath him began to glow with a soft blue light, the inlaid patterns illuminating one by one. The vibration intensified, becoming a physical pressure against my eardrums. "The surface," Hargrove gasped, pushing himself to his feet with visible effort. "We have to reach the surface before the gate opens." I didn't ask what gate he meant. Something primordial in my hindbrain recognized the danger, overriding curiosity with pure survival instinct. I grabbed Hargrove's arm, supporting his weight as we stumbled toward the passage. We were halfway to the exit when the chamber plunged into absolute darkness, not merely dim, but a complete absence of light that swallowed my headlamp beam like a black hole. The temperature plummeted, ice crystals forming instantly on my skin. "Too late," Hargrove moaned beside me. "They're here." In the perfect darkness, I heard something moving, not footsteps, but a slithering, multi-limbed progression across stone. The sound surrounded us, coming from all directions at once. Then, impossibly, I saw eyes opening in the darkness, not reflecting light, but generating their own pale blue luminescence. Dozens of them at varying heights, blinking in asynchronous patterns. They formed a circle around us, closing in with deliberate slowness. Hargrove began to laugh, a broken sound with no humor in it. I tried to warn people. The rangers, the Forest Service, they thought I was crazy. His voice dropped to a whisper. "But you brought the journal, you might still escape." Before I could respond, he broke from my grip and charged toward the closing circle of eyes. "Run," he screamed. "I'll hold them off." What happened next occurred in flashes of perception I still struggle to reconcile. Hargrove's body lifted from the ground, suspended in midair as the darkness itself seemed to flow into him through every orifice. His screams became something inhuman, a frequency that made my teeth vibrate. The eyes converged on him, and for an instant I glimpsed their owners' forms that violated every law of biology and physics, geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. I ran. Blind, terrified, I relied on instinct and memory to find the passage back to the first chamber. Behind me, Hargrove's screams cut off abruptly, replaced by a sound like 1,000 voices whispering in unison, not in my ears, but directly in my mind. My headlamp flickered back to life as I reached the first chamber, revealing the metal disc on its pedestal now rotating slowly on its axis, symbols glowing with the same blue light as the eyes in the darkness. I didn't stop to examine it, charging past toward the spiral staircase. I took the steps two at a time, lungs burning, legs trembling with exertion and terror. The whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. Words in an unknown language began to form in my thoughts, alien concepts forcing their way into my consciousness. When I finally burst out into the stone circle, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ruins. I didn't stop to catch my breath but ran directly for the forest, away from the entrance, away from whatever was pursuing me. Night fell as I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping my face, roots tripping my feet. I ran until my body gave out, collapsing against a tree trunk miles from the ruins. Only then did I realize I still clutched Hargrove's journal in one hand, its pages now marked with fresh symbols that hadn't been there before, written in a black substance that looked disturbingly like the fluid that had leaked from Hargrove's eyes. And though I was physically alone in the vast darkness of the Allegheny Forest, I knew with certainty that something was watching me, something that had followed me from the chambers below, something that was waiting for me to sleep. Chapter 3. The Watchers. Dawn arrived with a thin, cheerless light filtering through the canopy. I hadn't slept, instead spending the night with my back against a tree trunk, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. Every sound in the darkness had seemed amplified, threatening the crack of branches, the rustle of leaves, the occasional distant cry of some nocturnal animal. But nothing had emerged from the shadows to claim me. Not yet. My limbs were stiff with cold and immobility as I gathered my gear. The rational part of my mind argued that I should head directly back to civilization, to marked trails and ranger stations. But a compelling, almost obsessive curiosity had taken root. Hargrove's journal now seemed to burn in my pack, demanding attention, unveiling its secrets. I found a relatively flat rock and spread out the journal, along with the map that had fallen from its pages. The new symbols that had appeared overnight remained, glistening slightly despite being dry to the touch. When I tried to wipe one away, it seemed to sink deeper into the paper instead of smudging. Focusing on the map, I noticed something I'd missed in my initial examination. The tunnels shown beneath the forest floor weren't random. They formed a pattern, a spiral emanating from the stone ruins I'd found, with secondary nodes at specific locations. One of these nodes was marked in red, with coordinates that corresponded to a location only a few miles from my current position. The last coherent entries in Hargrove's journal referenced this location repeatedly. Secondary chamber located at Teonesta Creek confluence. Less damaged than primary site. Control mechanisms possibly intact. Must reach it before they understand what I've found. And later, Ranger Whittaker definitely compromised. Eyes changed yesterday during our conversation. He knows what I know now, others at the station too. Can't trust anyone in uniform. Going off-grid. If I can reach the second site, might find a way to close what I've opened. I checked my own topographical map. Teonesta Creek was indeed nearby, and if I pushed hard, I could reach the confluence by mid-afternoon. Part of me recognized the insanity of delving deeper into this mystery after what I'd witnessed. But if Hargrove was right, if something had indeed been awakened and was spreading through the forest, running might not save me anyway. Better to understand what I was facing. Better to find out if there was a way to stop it. I set off with a new determination, guided by both maps and the coordinates from the journal. The forest seemed different in daylight, still ancient and imposing, but less immediately threatening. Birds called from the canopy, small mammals rustled in the undergrowth. Normal forest sounds that should have been reassuring. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Occasionally, from the corner of my eye, I'd catch movement that disappeared when I turned to look directly. The symbols carved into trees appeared with increasing frequency, forming what seemed to be a path, one that, disturbingly, matched the direction I needed to go. By noon, I reached a small stream that, according to my map, fed into Teonesta Creek about a mile downstream. I followed it, the terrain growing increasingly rugged. Massive boulders dotted the landscape, some arranged in formations too regular to be natural. The trees here were older, their trunks twisted into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, as if they'd been growing around something invisible. And then I began to notice the wildlife, or rather the strangeness of it. A deer watched me from a thicket, unmoving even as I passed close by. But its eyes were wrong, too dark, too aware. Squirrels followed my progress from the branches above, their movements synchronized in a way that made my skin crawl. When I stopped to consult my map, a raven landed on a nearby stump. It cocked its head, regarding me with an intelligence that seemed impossible for a bird. Then it opened its beak and emitted a sound that was neither caw nor call, a series of clicks and guttural stops that mirrored the language I'd heard from Hargrove during his seizure. I backed away slowly. The raven watched me go, then took wing, circling overhead as if monitoring my movements. By mid-afternoon, I reached the confluence of the stream with Teonesta Creek. The location matched the coordinates from Hargrove's journal perfectly, but there was nothing immediately visible, no ruins, no cave entrance, nothing to suggest an underground chamber. I studied the journal again, looking for clues. The last coherent entry mentioned stone steps beneath the hanging tree. Looking around, I noticed an ancient oak growing at an angle over the creek, its massive trunk twisted sideways by time and gravity. The hanging tree, not for executions, but because it hung over the water. Approaching the oak, I examined its base and the ground around it. Nothing seemed unusual until I noticed a pattern in the exposed roots. They grew not into the soil but around something beneath them. Clearing away accumulated leaves and dirt revealed the edge of a stone slab. It took all my strength to shift the slab, sliding it sideways to expose a narrow opening and a set of stone steps leading downward. Unlike the ruins I'd found earlier, these steps were clearly man-made, probably dating to the early settler period. A mining shaft, perhaps, or a root cellar built by long-gone homesteaders. But as my flashlight beam penetrated the darkness below, I could see that the rough-hewn entrance gave way to something else. The same polished stone as the chambers beneath the ruins. The smart decision would have been to mark the location and leave, to bring back authorities or at least other people. But I knew now that I couldn't trust the local rangers if Hargrove's warnings were accurate, and something told me time was running short, that whatever had been awakened was growing stronger, spreading its influence through the forest. I descended the stairs, counting 27 steps before reaching a short passage that opened into a chamber significantly smaller than those beneath the ruins. This room was clearly functional rather than ceremonial, more like a control center or laboratory. Stone tables lined the walls, supporting apparatus made of the same unidentifiable metal as the disc I'd seen earlier. At the center stood a pedestal similar to the one in the ruins, but instead of a disc, it held what appeared to be a crystal or gem about the size of my fist. Unlike everything else in these ancient structures, it wasn't covered in symbols. Instead, it pulsed with its own inner light, cycling slowly through colors from deep purple to vibrant blue. On one of the tables lay a modern notebook, Hargrove's field journal, not the leather-bound volume I carried. The final entry, dated just 3 days earlier, was a hasty scrawl. Crystal is the key. Acts as both transmitter and containment. They can't fully materialize without it. If I can disrupt the resonance pattern, God help me, I've tried everything else. This is the only way left. Beside the notebook sat a small device cobbled together from what looked like standard electronic components. A modified radio transmitter connected to a digital oscilloscope. Hargrove had apparently been attempting to analyze or interfere with whatever signals the crystal was transmitting. As I studied the makeshift equipment, a soft humming began to emanate from the crystal. Its pulsing accelerated, the colors shifting more rapidly. The air in the chamber grew heavy, charged with static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand on end. A sudden noise from the entrance passage made me whirl around. Something was coming down the stairs, not the heavy tread of a human, but a strange, multi-limbed progression that reminded me too vividly of what I'd heard in the darkness beneath the ruins. Without thinking, I grabbed the crystal from its pedestal. Its surface was neither hot nor cold, but seemed to vibrate at a frequency that made my fingers tingle unpleasantly. The humming intensified the moment I touched it, and the light it emitted flared brilliantly before settling into a steady glow. The sounds from the passage stopped abruptly. Whatever was approaching had sensed the crystal's removal. I had seconds, perhaps, before it entered the chamber. Hargrove's device caught my eye again, specifically, a small ceramic bowl wired to the transmitter. A handwritten note beside it read, "Copper sulfate solution amplifies disruptive effect. 30% concentration most effective. The bowl contained a bluish liquid. Acting on instinct, I plunged the crystal into the solution. The effect was immediate and terrifying. A high-pitched whine filled the chamber, painful enough to make me cover my ears. The crystal's glow became blindingly intense, shifting through colors faster than the eye could process. The liquid in the bowl began to boil without heat, the crystal vibrating so violently it seemed on the verge of shattering. From the passage came a sound I can only describe as rage, a cacophony of inhuman voices screaming in that same guttural, clicking language I'd heard before. Something slammed against the walls, shaking dust from the ceiling. I had to get out, but the only exit led straight toward whatever was coming. Frantically, I searched the chamber for another escape route. In the far corner, partially hidden behind one of the stone tables, I spotted a narrow fissure in the wall, a natural crack that might lead to a connecting cave system. The crystal continued its violent reaction, the bowl now crackling with electrical discharges. I hesitated, knowing instinctively that I shouldn't leave it behind. Using my shirt to protect my hand, I fished the crystal from the solution and wrapped it in a bandana from my pack. The screaming from the passage intensified, accompanied now by a sound like tearing metal. Whatever was coming had been delayed but not stopped. I squeezed into the fissure, using my flashlight to navigate the narrow gap. It widened slightly after a few yards, becoming a natural limestone tunnel that sloped gradually upward. Water trickled along the floor, suggesting it might eventually lead to the surface. Behind me, the inhuman screams faded, replaced by something worse, silence, then the unmistakable sound of methodical pursuit. They were in the chamber now, and they were following. I scrambled through the tunnel system, scraping knees and elbows on the rough stone, the wrapped crystal clutched tightly in one hand. The bandana provided little insulation from its vibration, which seemed to pulse in time with my racing heartbeat. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I saw light ahead, daylight filtering through a gap in the rocks. The tunnel ended in a small opening partially concealed by brush, emerging on a steep hillside above Teonesta Creek. I burst from the hillside like a hunted animal, gasping in the fresh air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I needed to put distance between myself and the underground chamber, to find somewhere to hide until I could figure out what the crystal was and what I was going to do with it. As I hastily gathered my bearings, movement caught my eye across the creek. A figure stood watching me, a forest ranger in the standard olive uniform, too distant to make out their face clearly. They raised a hand, as if in greeting, then pointed deliberately at the bulge in my pocket where I'd stashed the wrapped crystal. "Return what you've taken," a voice called across the water, the words strangely accented. "It doesn't belong to your kind." I backed away slowly. The ranger made no move to pursue but continued watching with unnatural stillness. When they finally stepped from the shadows into a shaft of fading sunlight, I glimpsed their eyes completely black, like pools of oil. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush without regard for noise or direction, driven by pure instinct. Night was falling rapidly, and I had no plan beyond immediate escape. But one thing was becoming horribly clear. Whatever influence had been confined to the underground chambers was spreading throughout the forest, claiming both people and animals as its vehicles. And I now carried the key to either stopping it or helping it complete its emergence. A crystalline device from some unimaginable civilization that had arrived in these hills long before human history began. As darkness enveloped the forest, I realized I was no longer just running from something. I was running toward a confrontation that had been waiting for thousands of years to resume. Chapter 4. The Spreading Darkness. Night in Allegheny National Forest is absolute in its darkness. Away from civilization, with no moon and storm clouds gathering, I could barely see my hand in front of my face. My headlamp provided the only illumination, its beam seeming feeble against the vast blackness surrounding me. I had been moving north for hours, following no path but my own desperate need to put distance between myself and the possessed ranger. The crystal in my pocket vibrated continuously, its presence impossible to ignore, a warm, pulsing thing that seemed almost alive. When exhaustion finally forced me to stop, I found shelter beneath the exposed roots of a fallen hemlock. After setting up minimal camp with trembling hands, I unwrapped the crystal to examine it properly. In the beam of my headlamp, it glowed with inner light, cycling through colors from deep purple to vibrant blue. Its facets weren't random but followed mathematical patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. I couldn't identify the material, not quartz or any gemstone I recognized, but something harder, denser, with an unnaturally perfect clarity. Holding it gave me an odd sensation, as if I were touching something that existed partially in another dimension. Images flashed through my mind too quickly to comprehend vast structures beneath unfamiliar stars, beings of impossible geometry, technologies that defied human understanding. While studying the crystal, I became aware of a new sound cutting through the forest night: helicopter rotors, still distant but approaching. My first instinct was relief, rescue, civilization, but Hargrove's warnings echoed in my mind. The rangers aren't just rangers, check their eyes. I doused my headlamp and huddled deeper into my shelter. The helicopter drew closer, its searchlight cutting through the canopy in sweeping patterns about a half-mile to the east, directly over the area where I'd found the underground chamber. For nearly an hour, the helicopter circled the area, occasionally hovering in place. Through gaps in the trees, I could make out its silhouette, not the familiar shape of Forest Service or rescue aircraft, but something more angular, military in design, with no identifying markings visible. Eventually, it moved on, the sound of its rotors fading into the distance. But my relief was short-lived. New sounds emerged from the darkness: voices, human voices, calling to each other as they moved through the forest. A search party, but not one I wanted to encounter. Fan out. The energy signature is strongest in this sector. Remember, we need the host intact. The director wants specimens we can study this time. What about the artifact? Sensors indicate it's been removed from the containment pedestal. Priority 1. Without it, full manifestation isn't possible. We have maybe 48 hours before the connection destabilizes. Their voices carried clearly in the night air, professional and calm, but with an unsettling, emotionless quality. I counted at least 6 distinct speakers, moving in a search pattern that would eventually cross my position. I wrapped the crystal again and tucked it deep in my pack. My options were limited: staying hidden was only temporary, and movement would likely attract attention. But the search team's conversation had revealed something crucial. The crystal was important, needed for whatever process was unfolding. And they had a timeline: 48 hours before something destabilized. Which meant I had 2 days to figure out what to do with this thing, how to stop whatever was happening. I waited until the searchers had moved past my position before slipping away in the opposite direction. The overcast night was now my ally, the darkness concealing my movement as I picked my way carefully through the underbrush. Dawn found me several miles north of my starting point, exhausted but still mobile. The forest looked different in the gray morning light, subtle changes that might go unnoticed by casual observers. Fungus grew in perfect geometric patterns on tree trunks. Small plants twisted in unnatural spirals. The very soil seemed different, with a metallic sheen when disturbed. The infection, transformation, whatever it was spreading through the ecosystem itself. I needed a plan, a destination. Randomly fleeing through the forest would only delay the inevitable. I pulled out my map and Hargrove's journal, searching for anything that might help. The journal's later entries, though increasingly erratic, referenced a third site, a failsafe, location Hargrove had discovered in his research. Original survey maps from 1796 show it clearly, a structure predating European settlement, marked as ancient stones on the surveyor's notes. Located at the convergence of ley lines, it stands where the boundaries were strongest. If anywhere still holds the original containment properties, it would be there. He'd marked the location on his map, a spot near the northern boundary of the forest, close to the Kinzua Dam. If I pushed hard, I might reach it by nightfall. I set off with renewed purpose, no longer just running from something but moving toward a potential solution. The crystal in my pack continued its pulsing, but now seemed to fluctuate whenever I changed direction, growing stronger when I moved north toward my destination, weaker when I deviated from the path. By midday, I encountered the first signs of the search team's wider operation. Rectangular metal devices had been placed at regular intervals throughout the forest, each emitting a faint hum and displaying blinking red lights. I gave them a wide berth, suspecting they were some kind of monitoring equipment. The crystal's vibrations grew more intense as I passed near these devices, reacting to whatever signals they were emitting. Something about their presence seemed to agitate it, the colors cycling more rapidly, almost frantically. My progress slowed as I was forced to detour around these monitoring stations. Twice I spotted teams of people in unmarked black uniforms moving through the forest, carrying equipment I couldn't identify. Their movements were synchronized in the same unsettling way I'd observed in the wildlife, too coordinated, too precise to be natural. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge overlooking a section of forest where the transformation was dramatically advanced. From my elevated vantage point, I could see patterns in the vegetation visible only from above, concentric circles radiating outward from what I presumed was the original stone ruins I'd discovered. The colors were wrong too, the natural greens of the forest canopy tinted with metallic blues and purples that gleamed in the sunlight. More disturbing were the movements visible within this transformed zone, large shapes moving with purpose, no longer bothering to conceal themselves. I raised my binoculars and immediately wished I hadn't. What I saw defied categorization, neither fully animal nor human, but chimeric combinations that followed no evolutionary logic. Some moved on multiple limbs, others flowed across the ground like living liquid. All shared that same metallic sheen I'd observed in the possessed ranger's eyes. I checked my map again. My planned route would take me dangerously close to this heavily transformed area. The alternative was a significant detour that would add hours to my journey, making it impossible to reach the failsafe location before nightfall. As I deliberated, a new sound reached me, the helicopter returning, this time accompanied by others. 3 aircraft approached from the south, flying in tight formation. They weren't heading toward my position, but toward the center of the transformed zone. Through my binoculars, I watched as they hovered over a clearing and deployed what looked like scientific equipment on cables. They appeared to be taking readings or samples, maintaining a safe height above whatever was happening below. The operation was precise, professional, clearly not their first time dealing with this phenomenon. Which raised the question, how many other sites like this existed? How long had this been going on? The crystal vibrated more intensely as the helicopters conducted their survey, almost jumping in my pack. I removed it carefully, unwrapping the bandana to examine it again. The colors were cycling faster than before, and now I could see something new, tiny symbols appearing and disappearing on its surface, similar to those carved into the trees and ruins but constantly shifting. As I watched, the symbols stabilized momentarily into a pattern I recognized from Hargrove's journal, the one he had translated as gateway. A chill ran through me. This wasn't just a communication device or power source. It was a key to something, perhaps literally a gateway between worlds or dimensions. The helicopters completed their survey and moved toward my general direction. I quickly rewrapped the crystal and took cover among a cluster of boulders, pressing myself into shadow as they passed overhead. Whether they were searching specifically for me or conducting a broader survey was unclear, but I couldn't risk being spotted. Once they moved on, I made my decision. The direct route was too dangerous, too exposed. I would take the longer path, even if it meant traveling after dark. Better that than encountering whatever was emerging in the transformed zone. The detour took me west, then north again along a ridgeline that offered some protection from aerial observation. The terrain was challenging, steep in places, with loose rocks that threatened to send me sliding down the slope with each misstep. By sunset, I was still several miles from my destination, with the most difficult section yet to traverse. As darkness fell, I faced the choice of making camp or continuing through the night. The memory of the search teams and the transformed creatures decided me. I would keep moving, using my red filter headlamp to preserve my night vision while minimizing visibility from a distance. The night grew unusually cold for October, my breath forming clouds in the beam of my light. The forest sounds changed with sunset, normal nocturnal wildlife falling silent, replaced by calls and movements. I couldn't identify, sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Around midnight, I reached a section where the ridge descended sharply toward a valley. According to my map, I needed to cross this valley to reach the northern hills where the failsafe location awaited. The valley floor was shrouded in mist, a ghostly sea beneath the ridge. As I began my descent, the crystal's vibrations changed character, no longer just a physical sensation, but accompanied by what I can only describe as emotional impressions. Fear, urgency, warning. It was trying to communicate something. I paused, unsure whether to trust these impressions. Was I anthropomorphizing an alien artifact, or was it genuinely attempting to warn me? Either way, I proceeded with greater caution, alert to any sign of danger. The mist thickened as I reached the valley floor, reducing visibility to mere feet. My headlamp beam reflected back at me, creating a disorienting effect. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on fallen leaves and exposed soil. The crystal's vibrations became almost painful, the emotional impressions resolving into a single, overwhelming directive: danger, retreat. Too late, I realized my mistake. The mist wasn't natural fog, but something else entirely: particulate matter suspended in the air, moving with purpose, responding to my presence. It swirled around me, thickening, probing like millions of microscopic sensors mapping my physical form. I turned to retreat up the ridge, but the mist had closed behind me, forming a wall that moved with me. I was surrounded. From the depths of the mist emerged shapes, indistinct at first, then resolving into humanoid forms. Park rangers, hikers, ordinary people, but all moving with that same unnatural coordination, all with the same black, oil-swirl eyes. The artifact, one said, a middle-aged woman in hiking gear. Return it to us. It doesn't belong to you. You don't understand what you've taken, added another, a young man in a Forest Service uniform. What you've interrupted. I backed away, drawing the small knife from my belt, a pathetic defense against whatever these beings represented. What are you? I demanded. What do you want? We are the Advance, the woman replied, her voice now layered with others, as if multiple entities spoke through her. The preparation, the adaptation of this biosphere for habitation. Habitation by what? By those who were here before you, the ranger answered. The original inhabitants returning after their long exile. They continued to close in, moving with the inexorable patience of predators who know their prey is trapped. I clutched the crystal tightly, feeling its vibrations sync with my racing pulse. The gateway requires the key, the woman said, extending her hand. Return it willingly, and you may serve rather than be consumed. Consumed how? I asked, playing for time, frantically searching for an escape route. The ranger smiled, his face splitting unnaturally wide to reveal teeth that had been reshaped into needle-like points. Integration is most efficient when the host is willing, but we adapt. We improvise. To demonstrate, he raised his arm, which seemed to liquefy before my eyes, the flesh flowing like mercury into new forms, elongating, sprouting additional appendages, solidifying again into something that resembled a blade made of bone and metal. My human instinct for flight overrode all else. I turned and ran directly into the mist, hoping to break through their encirclement through sheer momentum. The possessed humans reacted instantly, converging on my position with inhuman speed. I felt hands grasp at my clothing, claws tear at my pack. Something sharp pierced my upper arm, sending waves of numbness radiating outward. The crystal in my hand pulsed violently, its light suddenly flaring bright enough to illuminate the entire misty valley. The effect on my pursuers was immediate and dramatic. They recoiled, shielding their eyes, their forms seeming to waver and destabilize in the crystal's light. The mist itself retreated, creating a bubble of clear air around me. I didn't question this unexpected advantage, but ran with all my remaining strength, clutching the now blazing crystal before me like a talisman. It cut a path through the mist, the possessed forms unable to approach its light directly. By the time I reached the northern slope of the valley, my lungs were burning and the crystal's light was beginning to dim. The numbness from whatever had pierced my arm was spreading, making my movements clumsy, my thoughts increasingly disjointed. I struggled upward, using tree trunks to pull myself along when my legs threatened to give out. Behind me, I could hear my pursuers regrouping, tracking me by some sense other than sight. The crystal's light faded to a dull glow, no longer providing protection. As I crested the ridge, my vision began to blur. The infection, whatever it was spreading through my system. I could feel it, an alien presence taking root in my mind, whispering, suggesting, trying to override my will. The map. I needed to check the map. The fail-safe location should be close now. With numb fingers, I fumbled with Hargrove's journal, struggling to focus on the marked location. Less than a mile north at the junction of two small streams. If I could just reach it before losing control. The whispers in my mind grew louder, more insistent. Images flashed before me, visions of vast cities of non-Euclidean geometry, of beings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, of a hive intelligence spanning galaxies. They weren't trying to frighten me anymore, but to seduce me, to show me the knowledge and power I could access if I surrendered. Join us, the voices whispered. Become more than human. Evolve beyond your limited form. Part of me, a growing part, wanted to accept. The offer was tempting in a way I couldn't have imagined before. But another part, the core of my identity, fought desperately against the intrusion. I focused on that resistance, using it to propel myself forward when my body wanted to surrender. The numbness reached my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. My vision narrowed to a tunnel, the edges darkening. The crystal pulsed weakly in rhythm with my failing heart. Just as I feared I would collapse, I broke through the tree line into a small clearing. In its center stood what I'd been seeking, a circle of standing stones, smaller than the ruins I'd found earlier but clearly of the same origin. The stones were etched with the same symbols, but these glowed faintly with their own inner light, a soft blue that seemed to repel the darkness. I stumbled into the circle, falling to my knees at its center. The effect was immediate. The whispers in my mind receded. The numbness in my limbs faded slightly. Something about this place was holding the infection at bay, creating a temporary sanctuary. The crystal in my hand responded to the environment, its glow strengthening, the cycling colors stabilizing on a deep blue that matched the light emanating from the standing stones. I placed it on the ground at the circle's center, and it seemed to sink slightly into the earth, finding a hollow perfectly shaped to receive it. As the crystal settled into place, the symbols on the standing stones brightened, sequences of light running from one stone to the next in complex patterns. The ground beneath me began to hum with energy, a counter-vibration to what I'd felt from the crystal, as if two opposing forces were achieving balance. Beyond the stone circle, dark shapes gathered at the edge of the clearing, my pursuers, hesitant to cross the boundary defined by the standing stones. Their forms seemed less stable now, flickering between human appearance and something else, something that hurt my eyes to look at directly. "You cannot stop what has begun," the woman called, her voice no longer remotely human. "The gateway will open, the masters will return. This world will be remade." I had no response, focusing instead on the crystal and its interaction with the stone circle. Something was happening, energy building, patterns forming. The crystal rose slightly from its hollow, hovering an inch above the ground, spinning slowly on its axis. The possessed beings began to circle the clearing, testing the boundaries, searching for weaknesses. Some tried to cross and were repelled by invisible forces, their forms distorting painfully. Others retreated into the forest, perhaps seeking reinforcements or alternative approaches. I don't know how long I knelt there, watching the crystal spin, feeling strength gradually return to my body as the infection receded. Time seemed to lose meaning within the circle's protection. At some point, I must have lost consciousness, my overtaxed system finally shutting down despite the danger. I awoke to morning light filtering through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the stone circle. The crystal still hovered at the center, spinning faster now, its color a deep, steady blue. The symbols on the standing stones continued their sequential illumination, creating a barrier that had held through the night. My pursuers were still there, watching from the forest edge, but they seemed changed, less substantial somehow, as if whatever force animated them was weakening. Some had collapsed entirely, the human hosts lying unconscious at the boundary of the circle. The infection in my arm had receded to a small, dark spot around the puncture wound. I could think clearly again, the alien whispers reduced to distant murmurs easily ignored. As I studied the crystal and the stone circle, understanding began to dawn, not complete knowledge, but insights pieced together from Hargrove's notes, my own observations, and perhaps some influence from my brief connection to the hive mind. This place was indeed a failsafe, created by the same civilization that had built the underground chambers. But unlike those structures, which served as containment for something that had been imprisoned, this circle was designed as a countermeasure, a way to close a gateway if it began to open prematurely. The crystal was both key and regulator necessary for full manifestation of whatever was trying to emerge, but also capable of reversing the process if properly aligned within this circle of stones. What I was witnessing was the beginning of that reversal, the energy being drawn back, the connections between worlds weakening rather than strengthening. And the entities beyond the circle knew it, their desperation evident in their increasingly frantic attempts to breach the barrier. As the morning progressed, more of the possessed forms collapsed, the controlling influence withdrawing as its connection to this world weakened. By noon, only the strongest remained, the woman and the ranger who had spoken to me in the valley, now barely recognizable as human, their forms partially transformed into something that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. "This is temporary," the woman called, her voice distorted, multi-layered. "A delay only. We have waited millennia. We will wait longer if necessary. The key will be recovered," the ranger added. "Other gateways exist. This world will be ours again." I had no way to know if they spoke truth or desperation. All I knew was that the process was working. The crystals spin now so rapid it appeared as a blue sphere of light, the symbols on the stones glowing bright enough to be visible even in daylight. By mid-afternoon, a change rippled through the forest, a sensation like pressure releasing, a sound too low to hear but felt in the marrow of bones. The last of the possessed forms shuddered, then collapsed as whatever had animated them withdrew completely. The crystal's spin began to slow, its glow dimming gradually. The symbols on the standing stones faded one by one until only a faint trace of blue light remained. In the sudden, profound silence that followed, I heard a familiar sound: helicopter rotors approaching from the south. The search teams, no doubt investigating the energy signatures from the stone circle. I had moments to decide: stay and try to explain what had happened, or take the crystal and run. The decision hinged on a crucial question. Were the search teams part of whatever had been trying to manifest, or were they human authorities trying to contain it? Hargrove's warnings echoed in my mind. Can't trust anyone in uniform. But he had also written of those who knew, who had been fighting to keep the gateways closed for generations. As the helicopters drew closer, I made my choice. Chapter 5, The Gateway. As the helicopters approached, I made my decision. I reached for the now dormant crystal, its surface cool to the touch, its inner light pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. I couldn't leave it behind, not because I wanted its power, but because I couldn't risk it falling into the wrong hands, whoever they might be. The first helicopter appeared over the tree line, its searchlight sweeping the clearing. I tucked the crystal into my deepest pocket and stepped out from the protection of the stone circle, waving my arms to attract attention. The response was immediate. The helicopter banked sharply, hovering directly overhead while two others maintained position at the perimeter. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker. "Remain where you are. Do not approach the stone formation. Rescue team inbound." 4 figures rappelled from the helicopter with military precision, dressed in matte black tactical gear, with no identifying insignia. Their faces were hidden behind specialized helmets with darkened visors. They moved with practiced efficiency, securing the perimeter before approaching me. "Civilian located," one reported into a communications device. "Appears conscious and mobile." Another approached me directly, scanner in hand. "Sir, I need you to remain still while I check for contamination." I complied, watching as the scanner passed over my body, its display flashing with data I couldn't interpret. It paused longer over my arm where I'd been injured, and again near my pocket containing the crystal. "Superficial contamination only," the operator announced. "Manageable with standard protocols. Artifact detected class 3 or higher." "Wait," I said as 2 of them moved to take my arms. "Who are you people? What agency?" The leader hesitated, then touched a control on his helmet, revealing his face. A middle-aged man with the weathered features of someone who spent considerable time in the field. "Department of Advanced Containment and Exclusion," he said. "DACE. We monitor and contain incursions like the one you've encountered." "Incursions? You mean you know what this is?" "What's happening in the forest?" He studied me carefully before responding. "We've been tracking this particular site for decades. It's one of 17 known gateway locations across North America. Or it was, until someone decided to go exploring where they shouldn't. His tone made it clear who he thought that someone was. "I didn't open anything," I protested. "I found Hargrove's journal and followed his notes. He was the one who activated something in those ruins." The man's expression hardened. Ellis Hargrove was one of ours, a field researcher studying the containment mechanisms at these sites. He went dark 3 weeks ago after reporting unusual energy readings. This revelation stunned me. Hargrove hadn't been a random explorer or conspiracy theorist, but an actual government agent studying these phenomena. That explained the sophisticated equipment in the underground chamber and his detailed knowledge of the symbols. "He's dead," I said quietly. "Or, worse than dead. I saw him in the chambers beneath the ruins. Something was controlling him, speaking through him." The team leader nodded grimly. "We suspected as much when his neural implant went offline. The same thing happened to the last 3 agents who investigated gateway activations. Which is why," he fixed me with a hard stare, "I need to ask about the artifact you're carrying." I instinctively touched my pocket containing the crystal. "It's some kind of key or regulator. Hargrove had it connected to equipment meant to disrupt its signals. When I put it in the stone circle, it seemed to reverse whatever process was happening in the forest." The leader exchanged glances with his team. "You placed the artifact in the convergence circle, voluntarily." "Yes, it seemed to be the only way to stop those things from spreading. And you were able to handle it without complete neural override." "Interesting." He made a decision. "We need to get you to a secure facility for full decontamination and debriefing. The artifact comes with us." Though suspicious, I had little choice. My body was still fighting off whatever infection had been introduced at the puncture wound, and I desperately needed medical attention. Besides, these people clearly understood what was happening far better than I did. I was secured in a harness and lifted to the helicopter, the crystal carefully removed from my pocket and placed in a specialized containment case by one of the team members wearing heavy protective gloves. Once aboard, medical personnel immediately began treatment, injecting me with a substance that brought blessed relief from the lingering whispers in my mind. As we lifted off, I watched through the window as the remaining team secured the stone circle, setting up equipment around its perimeter. They weren't dismantling it, I noted with interest, but reinforcing it somehow. "The convergence points can't be moved or destroyed," explained a woman in a lab coat who noticed my observation. "They're focal points where dimensional barriers are naturally thin. All we can do is strengthen the containment measures previous generations put in place." "Previous generations? How long have you known about these things?" She checked my vital signs before answering. "The department has existed in various forms since the late 1800s, originally as a secret division within the Army Corps of Engineers. The first documented gateway activation occurred in 1873, near what's now Yellowstone National Park." "And what exactly are these gateways? Where do they lead?" "That's classified beyond my clearance," she replied automatically, then softened slightly. "But I can tell you they don't lead to anywhere in our universe, at least not as we understand space-time." The helicopter journey took us to a facility hidden in the mountains of northern Pennsylvania, a complex of buildings that appeared on no official maps, disguised from aerial observation by advanced camouflage technology. I was immediately taken to a medical wing for intensive treatment. For 3 days, I drifted in and out of consciousness as they purged the alien influence from my system. The process was painful but effective, each treatment leaving me more myself, the foreign whispers in my mind growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. On the 4th day, I was deemed stable enough for debriefing. A man in a simple black suit introduced himself as Director Keller, head of DACE's Northeastern Division. He brought files, digital displays, and most surprisingly, Ellis Hargrove's complete journals. Normally, civilians who encounter gateway phenomena are subject to chemical memory suppression and released with cover stories. He began without preamble. But your case is unique. Not only did you survive direct mental contact with the entities, you successfully operated a Class 4 artifact without preparation or protection. The crystal, I said, remembering its pulsing warmth. More accurately, a dimensional resonance key technology created by the entities to maintain stable connections between their reality and ours. There are only 7 known to exist, and all were supposed to be in our secure storage. Until Hargrove took one, I guessed. Keller nodded grimly. Hargrove was researching methods to permanently seal the gateways. He believed the keys themselves, properly modified, could be used to collapse the dimensional interfaces. His last report indicated a breakthrough, but then he went dark. He succeeded, I said, suddenly understanding. That's what the device in the underground chamber was, his prototype. He connected the crystal to disrupt its function, and when you placed it in the convergence circle, you completed what he started. Keller's expression was difficult to read. Preliminary readings show the Allegheny Gateway has collapsed by approximately 60%. Not sealed completely, but significantly weakened. Isn't that good news? It's unprecedented. Previous attempts to seal gateways have resulted in catastrophic backlash, the entities simply forcing them wider in response. Something about your interaction with the key was different. I thought about my experiences, the strange emotional connection I'd felt with the crystal, the way it had seemed to communicate warnings, the sensation that it was working with me rather than being merely a tool. I think, I said slowly, it might have been trying to help, not the entities but the key itself, as if it had its own agenda. Keller studied me intently. That aligns with Hargrove's later theories. He believed the keys were not created by the entities willingly, but forced from them, weapons designed by whatever civilization originally defeated and imprisoned them thousands of years ago. And now you want me to help you understand how I used it, I concluded. That's why I'm getting the full explanation instead of memory drugs. We'd like to offer you a position, yes. Your unique compatibility with the artifact makes you valuable, but there's another reason. He hesitated, then continued. The entities are becoming more active worldwide. Gateway sites that have been dormant for centuries are showing energy spikes. Something has changed in their dimension, some power shift or new technology that's allowing them to exert greater influence across the barriers. You think they're planning a coordinated attack, an invasion. We think they're desperate. Your actions in the Allegheny Forest have shown that their gateways can be permanently damaged. They'll respond with everything they have before we can replicate that success at other sites. The implications were staggering. What I had experienced in those few days, the possession, the transformations, the alien whispers was just a small-scale version of what could happen globally if these entities broke through in force. What happens now? I asked, suddenly aware of the weight of knowledge I now carried. You have a choice, Keller said. Option 1, complete memory suppression, a generous compensation package, and return to civilian life with no recollection of these events. Option 2, join DACE as a special consultant, help us understand the key's interaction with you, and potentially assist in closing other gateways. Is there really a choice? If what you're saying is true, the world is in danger. The danger has existed for centuries, Keller countered. We've contained it before, we may contain it again without your help. Don't underestimate the personal cost of option 2. You'll never have a normal life again. The entities know you now, know what you can do. You'll be a primary target if they break through anywhere. I considered his words carefully. The rational choice was option one: forget everything. Return to my life. Let specialized professionals handle the interdimensional horrors. But every time I closed my eyes, I still saw those oil-black eyes of the possessed, still felt the crystal resonating with my heartbeat, still heard Hargrove's warning about what was coming. I need to see it, I said finally. The crystal, before I decide. Keller hesitated, then nodded. Reasonable request, but only through secure viewing protocols. He led me to a specialized laboratory deep within the facility. In the center, contained within multiple layers of shielding, sat the crystal on a pedestal. Even through the barriers I could sense its presence, a faint hum at the edge of perception, a pull like distant music. As I approached the viewing window, the crystal's inner light pulsed brighter, cycling through colors before settling on the deep blue I'd seen in the convergence circle. It was responding to me, recognizing me. In that moment, I understood something fundamental. This wasn't just about me, or even about Dace's mission. The crystal itself was a conscious entity of sorts, a technology so advanced it blurred the line between object and being. It had chosen to work with me for reasons I might never fully comprehend. "I'll do it," I said, turning to Keller. "I'll help you understand how to close the gateways." The weeks that followed were intense specialized training, medical modifications to enhance my resistance to gateway influences, endless tests with the crystal under controlled conditions. I learned about the long history of DACE, the global network of similar organizations monitoring gateway sites, the ancient civilizations that had first battled these entities and created the convergence circles as planetary defense systems. Most importantly, I learned that what happened in the Allegheny National Forest was not an isolated incident. Reports were coming in from around the world: strange phenomena in remote forests, unnatural weather patterns, people going missing only to return changed in subtle but disturbing ways. The gateways were activating simultaneously for the first time in recorded history. 6 months after my camping trip, I stood in another convergence circle, this one in the mountains of Colorado. The crystal hummed in my hand, responding to my touch in ways the scientists still couldn't fully explain. Around me, DACE operatives maintained a secure perimeter, monitoring equipment showing the dimensional distortions rippling outward from a nearby cave system. Energy signatures are consistent with final stage gateway formation, reported the technical lead. Breakthrough estimated in 6 minutes. I took my position at the center of the stone circle, feeling the familiar resonance building between the ancient stones and the crystal in my hand. This would be our first attempt to proactively close a gateway before full activation, a technique we developed based on what I'd done accidentally in Pennsylvania. As I prepared the crystal, focusing my mind on the specific frequencies we'd identified as disruptive to gateway formation, I couldn't help reflecting on how completely my life had changed. My camping trip in Pennsylvania truly had been a deadly mistake, but perhaps a necessary one. I thought of Hargrove, whose research had made this possible, who had sacrificed himself trying to warn others. I thought of the possessed ranger with oil-black eyes, a harbinger of what awaited humanity if we failed. And I thought of the countless unknown people who had built these stone circles across the world thousands of years ago, creating a defense system they hoped would never be needed again. The crystal pulsed in my hand, its light growing brighter as it synchronized with the convergent circle. I felt the now familiar connection forming, the crystal becoming an extension of my consciousness as it had in the Allegheny Forest. "Gateway reaching critical expansion," called the technician. 30 seconds to break through. I raised the crystal high, its blue light now bright enough to illuminate the entire circle. The stone markers responded, ancient symbols glowing with the same light, completing a circuit that had lain dormant for millennia. As the gateway began to form, a shimmering distortion in the air above the cave entrance, I felt something push against my mind the entities, sensing what we were attempting, trying to stop us. But I was prepared now, trained to resist their influence. The crystal flared brighter, the convergence circle amplifying its energy. The gateway distortion wavered, contracted, then began to collapse in on itself like a star imploding. From the other side came a sound not physical but psychic, a scream of rage and frustration that echoed in the minds of everyone present. Then silence, as the gateway winked out of existence. Gateway collapse confirmed, the technical lead announced, voice steady despite the tension. Dimensional integrity restored to baseline. Containment successful. The team erupted in contained celebration professional, restrained but genuine. This was the first proactive gateway closure in DACE's history, proof that we could fight back against whatever waited on the other side. As I lowered the crystal, now cooling in my hand, I knew this was just the beginning. Other gateways were activating worldwide, and whatever force drove these entities wasn't going to stop after one defeat. The war that had been fought in shadows for centuries was emerging into the open. My camping trip in Pennsylvania had been a deadly mistake that changed my life forever. But perhaps it was also the mistake that would save humanity from what waited beyond the gateways, patient and hungry, in the spaces between dimensions. I looked at the crystal in my hand, its light pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat, and wondered if it had been chance at all that led me to Hargrove's journal, to the ruins, to this moment. Some mistakes, it seemed, were actually destiny in disguise.